Welcome to the release seminar of Dr. Magnus Norell's book, Return of the Caliphate, Reasons and Consequences. My name is Johan Westerholm, and I'm the publisher of Ledarsidorna.se with the publishing house, Grey Cat Publishing House. With us today for the seminar, we have the author himself, Dr. Magnus Norell. He is adjunct scholar at the Washington Institute. And we have Mr. Göran Adamson, who is guest professor at the European Center for European Studies in Bangkok. And of course, our special guest for tonight, Dr. David Pollock, who is right now at the Washington Institute, and he has previously been at the US State Department for the Far East?
Near East.
Near East, yes. Yeah. And I'll keep it short. So now, over to Ricki Neuman. He has been formerly editor at the Svenska Dagbladet, and is very well known from the culture sector in Sweden and on the newspaper Svenska Dagbladet. And you will not have to listen to me anymore, but I just want to remind you that turn on, when the seminar is over, don't forget to turn on the sound on your mobile phones so your relatives and beloved ones can reach you. And after the seminar, you will, all of you will get a free, your own copy of the book. And if you're nice enough, Dr. Norell might sign it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And my first question is, do you hear me? Yes. Okay, very good. So together we're going to visit our darkest and most violent neighborhood, the Middle East and North Africa. And also talk about how the war, the terror and the chaos is affecting us in Sweden, in Europe, and in the West. To fully understand Magnus' book, I think we have to backtrack. We have to go back in time. And I would like to start with the year 2011. The Arab Spring, the year of the Arab Spring. A lot of people around the world were extremely enthusiastic and hoped this uprising would change the region. And it sure did. There were very few people who were skeptical at that time, who didn't fully applaud what was going on. And one of them was Magnus. So you sort of joined the party poopers. Why? What did you see that others didn't?
Well, it's a good question. I think a lot of people saw what I saw but didn't want to acknowledge it. I think the euphoria and told us something about the wish for something better to come out of this, even though I'm sure a lot more people than me actually did see it, but didn't become the party poopers and saying it like I did. But then, of course, you brought down the house, you brought down the structure. There was nothing to build on. There's no country in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, who's ever been a real democracy. Well, Turkey, of course, which is going quickly in the other direction. So what kind of, it's very easy to tear something down, but there was no idea of what's going to come together. Just democracy. What kind of democracy? And of course, where it did start, it started with the wrong stuff. You started with elections instead of starting with building the institutions that kind of support the elections. So I think a lot more people than me saw what happened, but didn't really want to say it or acknowledge it.
Okay. So we move on to the year 2014. The caliphate is established, and a number of experts say that the chaos, the war, the terror in this region is mainly caused by the US invasion of 2003. But you don't agree. Say more about that.
Again, I don't agree.
Yeah.
Story of my life. I don't agree. Yeah, that was of course part of it, and that war helped create a geographical space for the caliphate. But the ideas, and that's really the main thing here, I think, the ideas, the underlying ideology was already there. There was really nothing new in the Islamic State at all. They didn't invent anything. So all the building structures, the building ideas of the caliphate was already there. Mm-hmm. And that had nothing to do with the US invasion of Iraq.
So, okay, so would you describe this as mainly a battle dealing with religion and political power, and inside the Muslim world?
Yeah, it's a battle, you know, it's a battle encompassing religion and politics. This is the thing. Mm-hmm. And that's the camel in the room that we're not mentioning here. The fact that you know, there is a connection here between politics and religion. That's nothing new either. We know this already, or we should know it. Mm-hmm. And as long as that remains a fact, you know, you're going to have maybe not the Islamic State, but you're going to have similar problems popping up from time to time. The Islamic State was not the first attempt to create a new or a better caliphate, as I point out in the book. And it will happen again.
So would you say we in the West are not guilty for a change?
Well, I'm sure we're guilty of something. I mean,
no, but if we talk about the kernel, the center of this conflict.
No, we're not. This is an internal Islamic conflict that really affects us, but that was already there.
Okay. So let's move on to the year 2015. This year you wrote a book about ISIS and its presence in the West, and you sent the manuscript to 12 Swedish publishers. Some of them had already published books of yours, and they all say the same thing. It's a good book, it's an important book, it's a timely book, but we don't have room for it right now. Too bad. So what exactly, of course this is something, you know, you have to imagine, but what exactly do you think they were afraid of? What went through their heads when they read this manuscript?
Yeah, well, as is probably no surprise, I've been thinking about that. I didn't see it coming, to be honest. I mean, I didn't really, you know, walk in from the street and say, hey, I've got this manuscript.
How many books had you published at that point in Swedish?
In Swedish, 4.
4 books, okay. So you were an established writer.
Yeah, on this very topic. I mean, you know, I know this shit, as they say in the US. So I didn't expect to be turned down for the reasons you've written a really good book. I mean, that's not, you've written a really bad book. Fine, I can buy that. But there is a fear here to talk about Islamism, of course, and it was a surprise. I mean, I knew that there was a fear and a resistance to talk about these issues, but I did not expect it to be that deep, honestly. So but I think there is a message here, and the message is, at least at that time, you know, this is going too far ahead of where the society is concerning public discussions of these issues.
Okay. But when you say fear, is it a fear of being not politically correct and being accused of being racist, or is it a fear of actually being physically attacked?
Well, obviously, I can't answer that. I think it's both. You know, I honestly think it's both, and I think it's subconscious to a very large extent. I don't think people are necessarily afraid of being, you know, shot or anything for publishing the book, even if that did happen.
No, that happened in France.
Yeah, in Norway and in Japan. So, but I really don't think that was a conscious fear, but I think there was certainly a fear of touching a subject that, you know, let's stay out, let somebody else do this.
Okay.
You know, I'll just back away from it.
Okay. So let's move to this year, 2017. The English version of this book is published by Grey Cat, and that's why we're here. Very good. So if you would have waited 2 years, do you think some of those publishers would have said yes? In other words, do you feel that the climate in some way has changed?
Yeah, I get that a lot, but I think the jury's still out, to be honest. I see signs of changes, but I think there is certainly still a resistance to talk about these issues. I'm not sure I'm that optimistic, that because I'm getting this very often. If you've done it now, but I didn't. You know, I wrote it then, not now. So it's really, we'll never find out. Mm-hmm. I've had people saying, well, you know, if publishers too, saying if I had known, you know, I would have done it. That's easy to say with hindsight. Mm-hmm. So I don't really take that too seriously. But I think that there is a, I'm not sure, to be honest, but it is being published in English now by a Swedish publisher. Mm-hmm. So yeah, of course there is a change. But then again, Grey Cat is a very new publishing house. It's only been around for, what, 6 months?
I think there is a change going on, but it might not be a change in the right direction, because I think, maybe what we're witnessing is a kind of political polarization where people on that side who said we can't publish your book, they are not changing. But then on the other hand, there might be possibly a growing sense of awareness among people like us.
So where do you see that? Give us examples.
Well, for instance, the audience here, and I mean some general tendencies in society.
You are the heroes.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is just an abstract idea, but I think there's a kind of political polarization going on in the US also, and in Europe, and Brexit, yeah, where somehow, I mean, if you, the image of maybe the floor is caving in, so you have the political middle ground, and then less and less people are voting for the middle parties, and there's a growing interest of the extremes on both sides. I don't know, but that's an impression I have, that there are changes going on, but they might not be the changes that we want somehow.
So could you give some positive examples of changes? Try.
Not too, yeah, I'm trying, okay? Just let me think. Give me a minute. No, I think it is a sign that the book is coming out now. There is, if you look at the media, there is a certain hate and willingness to discuss these issues. I agree with Göran that the changes might not all be that good, but so you see stuff like that. There are a number of articles you didn't see 2 years ago dealing with these issues. That's good. But if it's going to be enough, I'm not sure about that. Okay. You know, I'm not.
Can
yeah?
I'd like to jump in here if I could.
Sure.
And first of all, I want to thank everybody for speaking English. It really,
it makes
I really
easier.
mean it. It's a big help for me. And I want to say that I see some positive changes, not so much in Europe or here in Sweden, and certainly not in the United States, unfortunately. But I do see some positive changes in the Muslim world that relate to this question of attitudes toward extremism. And you have important, different tendencies, but at least one of them is that there are some significant Muslim countries, even Saudi Arabia, in the last few months, that is trying somehow to distance itself from the most extreme versions of its own religious and political tradition. And in some Arab countries, again, important ones, not all of them, you have the government stepping up in the last couple of years and declaring the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization, or declaring Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization. These are Muslim societies, Arab countries that are taking those steps. So I see this as at least potentially an important positive change.
So why do you think that happens now?
It happens now, I think, partly because of ISIS, the Islamic State, Daesh, whatever you want to call it.
Because ISIS is losing?
No, no, no. This was a reaction, a somewhat delayed response to the rise of ISIS in 2014 and the threat that many of these governments and many of these people felt. You know, one of the things that I do for a living is to do public opinion polls in the Middle East, even in very closed Arab countries where nobody else does this. And I ask people in systematic public opinion surveys, thousands of people, how much support there really is for. And Magnus, I want to thank you for actually quoting some of these
I know.
points in your book. I ask people how much support there is for the Islamic State, or for the Muslim Brotherhood, or for Hezbollah in these societies. And I think these are very credible, anonymous, right, confidential surveys. And it turns out that at least when you're talking about the Islamic State, that there was honestly almost no popular support for it in any Arab country that I did a survey in. Almost none, single digits, 2%, 3%, something like that. So people in those countries were shocked and afraid and disgusted by what they saw as the extreme perversion of Islam, of their own religion.
But what about Hezbollah and Hamas?
Yeah, that's different. Unfortunately, okay. I don't want to like take up too much more time on this, but I'll say very briefly, based on the same surveys. Okay, in most Arab countries, support for Hezbollah has dropped really very, very sharply in the last few years. And that's, I think, I'm pretty sure, actually, not so much because they see it as extremist or terrorist, it's because they see it as Shiite, right? As pro-Iranian. And it is. Yeah. And now people understand that. More Muslims understand that this is a sectarian, pro-Iranian political movement, not a resistance or a religious or a nationalist movement. And it's not good for them. So support for Hezbollah has really dropped tremendously. Support for Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood has also declined, but not nearly as much. So even in countries in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, or in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood has been outlawed and the government calls it a terrorist organization, even more strongly opposed to it than my own government back in Washington. The public, the population in those countries, you will find that still about 25% or even 30%, or sometimes even more than that, maybe as much as a third of the public says privately that they still support the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. Let's go back to Sweden. In the foreword, Magnus, you indicate that the radicalization of Muslims has increased in Sweden and in Europe in spite of all the efforts to stop it. And you say that we are as unprepared as ever when it comes to ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood. And in some ways, things are worse. And it's difficult to read that because, after all, don't we have more facts? Don't we have more insight? Both politicians and journalists seem to know a little bit more, or is that the wrong impression?
Well, we have more insights, we have more facts. I agree with that. But these are thick-headed people. You know, it's kind of hard to penetrate. I think, and I think, what's the word? You know, you fact resistant. Well, that goes for this too. I mean, it's fairly easy to see that this has failed. If you look at, Göran could talk more about this, but if you look at the kind of money put into sort of to mitigate this situation in Europe, you know, the opposite has happened. You know, radicalization is increasing. It's the fastest growing, and this is interesting because it sort of goes a bit against what Dave is saying here about what's happening in the Middle East. That's why I wrote the book. That's why I wrote the book. I wanted to give these people in the Middle East a voice that they never get here. You know, people saying, hey, you know, the Islamic State is our, we created this monster, we have to deal with it. And they are dealing with it. This is the positive news. And I wanted to, you know, those are the heroes of my book. But at the same time as that is happening in the Middle East and North Africa, the opposite is sort of, in a sense, happening here. And that is interesting, I think, and it's worrisome. It's very worrisome.
So why, I don't understand, why is people becoming more radicalized in Europe?
Well,
more Muslims are more radical than before.
I don't know the numbers here, but the thing is that these are the organized Muslims. You know, the organizations, the most organized people in West Europe are Islamist organizations. You know, and this is the. It's like we are sort of going forward and backwards at the same time. On the one hand, you say you want to integrate these people, so you give them money for organizing. Who are organizing? The people who doesn't want to integrate. The rest,
like for example,
the majority
of Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, that's a good example. But the majority just want to be Swedes. You know, they're not interested. Most Swedish Muslims are not even they're not even organized in a Muslim organization. Now, why should they? They would just want to be Swedes. But instead of letting that happening, we are collectivizing people into organizations, which is, you know, it goes against the whole. And you'd think this shouldn't be rocket science. Apparently, it is, which is also scary when you think about it. You know. But that is what's happening. And I think it's also the fact that these organizations are very entrenched. It's not like it happened for the past 5 or 10 years. It's been going on for 30 years. You know, these are entrenched organizations. Look at the pushback we got when we wrote the Muslim Brotherhood report here. You know, a tiny 4-week report just stating the basics. And, you know, the shit hit the fan. And that's kind of amazing. In a country calling itself a liberal democracy, where you're supposed to talk about all issues, no, you can't do that. Well, you can do it, but you know it comes with a price. Yeah. So, and that discrepancy between what we say we want to do and what we're doing is this is the result.
Okay, I think it's time to turn to Göran, because you have written a great deal about some of the problems in Sweden. And you are very critical when it comes to multiculturalism.
Yes, I am.
And you're very critical when it comes to identity politics.
Yeah.
And the way you see it is that these trends, movements, whatever we should call them, are actually working against liberal values, are actually working against democracy.
Yeah.
Say more.
Well, I wrote a book and it came out in English right now, and it's called The Trojan Horse. A leftist critique of multiculturalism in the West. So what I'm doing, I mean, I'm not alone here, but in Sweden I'm pretty much alone, because most people in Sweden, they think that either you think multiculturalism and diversity ideas is great, or you're a Sweden Democrats, or you're a fascist. But I think, I mean, you can take Slavoj Žižek, and you can take a lot of other names, Marxists and socialists and also feminists internationally, who say the same thing as I do. Because I think, this is also the title of my new book, that the whole idea of diversity is a Trojan horse. We think it is a nice, leftist, progressive, radical idea. But if you take a closer look, you realize, at least that's my conclusion, you realize that these ideas are at best conservative, if not reactionary ideas. And I could just give one example from my book. And I think this also relates to what we talked about before, the fact that unless you have pretty much the very nice, cozy, sweet, new leftist ideas about these things. You're barred, you're excluded, you're marginalized, you're no good. Because if you, I mean, I think this is this is again not rocket science, but I think it's still people don't seem to understand this or see it the way I do. Because if you talk about a multiculturalist or somebody, a diversity advocate, there is one thing they keep talking about. They keep talking about the virtue of roots. And they talk about identity, they talk about background, they talk about history, belonging, historical wrongdoings, etc. And it's a lot of sentimental rhetoric here. And then if you look around, you realize that there is only one other group in society where the idea of roots is as strongly pronounced. And this is among the right-wing populists. They also talk about roots, they also talk about identity, they also talk about background, history, us, so to speak. But the difference here, and I think the difference is not that important, because principally, in terms of principle, it's the same thing. Because whereas the multiculturalists, they talk about roots overseas, the virtue of roots overseas. The good old classic jingoists and right-wing populists, etc., they talk about roots here. You see? And this is the only difference, at least as far as I understand. This is the only difference between the right-wing populists on the one hand and the multiculturalists on the other hand. And if you try to sell this in Swedish academia, you have a hard time. It's an uphill battle, to put it mildly. So I think the only difference here is actually geographical. There is a geographical difference in terms of the turf or the soil where you have somehow sunk your personality. The right-wing populists and Sweden Democrats, they talk about our roots, our background. And the multiculturalists, they talk about roots overseas. But it's basically the same sentimental rhetoric, the same romantic, idealistic nonsense, you might say, if you're a liberal like I am. And yet these two factions, they fight endlessly. And there is no, I would actually argue that there is practically no other conflict in society as tense, and there is no relation in politics at present in the Western world as great as the tension between the diversity advocates and the right-wing populists. And yet they are saying the same thing. So and this is, from my point of view, is mind-boggling. I don't understand it. And then you try to talk to your PC, sometimes, colleagues about this. And then you say, hey, you know, I actually think you say the same things as Jimmy Åkesson and the Sweden Democrats. And you just can't say this. Then you're asking for trouble. So I'm fighting with everybody here. And
so you know, could you say a little bit more in what way immigrants to Sweden are affected by this value system or this theory?
Well, I would say that what we are doing, I mean, this is about multiculturalism, isn't it? It's about telling people that you don't have to integrate, you don't have to be part of the Swedish community society. You can stay where you are, you can foster your ideas, because it creates a colorful society. And then, on the other hand, whether these colors are nice or maybe contains problems, we don't want to know, because we are mesmerized and hypnotized by the colorfulness, the rainbow society, etc. So I think, and this also relates to my idea that the whole idea of multiculturalism is, I would say, conservative or even reactionary, because we tell these people to stay where they are. We tell them you don't have to change, because if we would say maybe you should change, maybe there are certain cultures or religions, no names, that maybe would somehow change a little bit to become more modern, to become more equal in terms of men and women, etc. If you say that, you're branded immediately as a racist, or even worse. So the funny thing here that, I mean, I would say, and I've said it in interviews before, I think multiculturalists, they have a problem with the idea of social change. Because all they are actually saying is that other cultures, they are fantastic and nice and natural, pristine, unique, and they should not change. Because if they change, we are violating. If we try to maybe foster some change, this is a racist colonialist approach. So I think that means that we are keeping them, we are telling them to stay and not to change and not become Swedish, which in certain senses might be a good thing. I think.
And we also put them into collectives. You know, the individuals are gone. You know, you're supposed to be belonging to a collective, and you're all supposed to be in that collective, have the same ideas, eat the same food, and as Göran says, don't change, never change. You know,
don't change.
Don't change.
So you want to add something about identity politics, or do you feel that we've covered that too?
No, I think I'm just writing a little piece about identity, and identity used to be more related to you because it has to do with being unique somehow. But now identity politics has nothing to do with the person, with individual. It has a lot to do about your culture, your background, something great, majestic, which is bigger than you are, and you're supposed to somehow vanish into that beautiful culture or entity. So I think now the whole idea of identity politics is a deeply collectivist idea, deeply collectivist, anti-individualist idea, and again, I think there are a lot of highly conservative ideas surrounding the idea of identity politics. And it's like we can be individuals, we can be unique, but people who come from minority cultures, they don't need to bother about being unique individuals. They can stay in their beautiful tribe or clan or whatever it is, and they can rejoice and live as unique, as faceless representatives of some mystical history or culture, whatever that is. And from my point of view, this is clearly a very romantic, conservative, almost fascist notion of human beings. And it is defended by people who claim to be leftists. And that's, again, I fail to understand this. And most leftists in Sweden, academics, they just don't see this, and they refuse to see it. And,
so Göran, I know you have somewhat of a European perspective. Would you say we're in worse shape in Sweden if you compare, for example, with England or Germany?
Yeah, I would say that we are in worse shape because I think, I mean, just to mention Magnus' brilliant book. If he had taken this book, if he had been a German guy, there would be at least 10 or if not 50 publishers who would have exactly his view about this, and they would say, we want to publish it. But in Sweden, it's all very, very hegemonic. They all think alike. It's like in Sweden, we can only afford one idea per 30 years or something. And now we have the idea of diversity, and everybody loves it. And if you question it, you just can't do it. So I think that one of the problems in Sweden that there is a tremendously hegemonic idea dominating the media, dominating academia where I'm active myself, and also party politics, of course, throughout the entire spectrum. And this is, I mean, you could say this has some kind of side taste of totalitarianism. That might be to overstate it, but it's very, very dangerous for an open discussion, because what I try to do in my book and what Magnus tried to do in his book is just to say, let's talk about this. That's the only thing we want. We just want to talk about it. And the funny thing, just to mention what happened to my book, my colleagues, nobody said, this is a bad book. Well, let's have an argument about it. They didn't say anything. There was just complete silence. And my book was a plea, you know, let's talk about this. I have a couple of good ideas. No arguments, no counter arguments. And the fact that what happened to Magnus' book, which is a fantastic book, and it speaks volumes about a lack of interest in discussions in Sweden. And I think for that reason, I think Sweden is in much worse shape than Germany or England.
I think there's a lack of discussion, but I don't think there's a lack of interest for the population as a whole.
Oh, no.
But it's just there's no way, there's no platforms. As you say, the academia is shut. A large part of media at least used to be shut. Maybe that is changing, but there are no platforms. There are no town halls. So that's another reason. I think that there's a discrepancy here between the interest that is there and the lack of space to have the discussions, to have the discussions.
Because your book has sold very well, right?
Yes, yes.
And you were forced to publish it yourself.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so this is a very dark issue. We're talking about very dark subject matters. I want to go back to one thing that you spent a few pages dealing with in the Swedish version and in the English version, the heroes.
Yeah.
The Arab Muslim heroes, people who dare to speak up, people who have the courage to propose a separation between state and religion. Mm-hmm. How are they doing today? You indicated that they're doing better today.
Yes, they are.
What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I can't argue with that. Can I?
We can argue.
We can argue. No, I think, as Dave said, I'm quoting his excellent research here. I do think, however, that the conflicts, the wars in the Middle East have not been good or conducive to be a reformist.
That's true.
It's still a very dangerous place to be a reformist in. And of course, a number of the people I'm quoting, not all of them, but a number of them are speaking from outside. And here's the thing. I think I say that somewhere in the book, but it's never been, as Dave indicated, it's never been a problem discussing Islamism in the Middle East. Never. From Casablanca, in the west to Kabul in the east. Everybody knows exactly what we're talking about here. They may agree with you, they may disagree with you, but there's never a problem discussing it. It's here it's a problem discussing it. It's here you have to look over your shoulder when you talk about these issues. And that's interesting too. So I think on the one hand, as Dave says, the polling is obvious. People don't want this. This is not.
But they don't speak up.
No, exactly. I was just coming to that. They don't. But because there again, to be able to speak up, you need platforms. You need places.
Structure.
You need structures. You need someone to do that. And if you don't have that, you can't. So on the one hand, yes, it's become better because a lot more people are actually at least expressing, even if it's in an opinion poll where you can be sort of be anonymous. They are expressing a resistance to this, and at the end of the day, at the end of that process, may come this reformist movement that we are looking at. But on the other hand, it's worse because the wars going on in the Middle East have squeezed them even more. So it's a dual picture here.
Okay, we need light. We need more light, and for a long time, the Kurds were the light. They were the good guys. They were good fighters.
They still are.
They were, the main force liberating Raqqa. And you were recently in Erbil when the Kurdish referendum took place.
Yes.
So tell us, is it still light coming from the Kurds, or where are we?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's a mixed picture. I think that we had a moment in 2013, 14, 15, when there was a lot of light in that arena. Not only because the Kurds were some of our best partners in fighting against the Islamic State, but also because they were making some progress at rapprochement with their other neighbors, and particularly with Turkey. It's hard to believe today, but only a few years ago, the Turkish government was holding peace talks with the PKK inside Turkey and was hosting official meetings with the head of the Syrian Kurdish PYD party in Ankara and in Istanbul. And so that was, for me, a source of some optimism and encouragement. But today, I'm sorry to say, we see the Kurds, for the most part, still as a bastion of moderation and even secularism. but their relations with all of their neighbors have gone sharply downhill in just the last year. So the referendum...
Was that inevitable?
No, I don't think it was inevitable, but there are very powerful forces in the region and in the world arrayed against Kurdish nationalism, and I don't think that this is mainly a religious issue, but it's an ethnic and a power issue for Baghdad, for Ankara, for Tehran, all of them, for their own internal political power reasons, are intent on very severely limiting Kurdish national or ethnic aspirations, or even autonomy is something that they can't accept, and for the Kurds. And so, while not inevitable, I don't want to ever say that anything bad is inevitable, but I think it was all too, let's say, likely that there would be a backlash inside Turkey, inside Iraq, as the Iraqi armed forces who melted away in 2014 in the face of a small terrorist group. Now they're stronger, much stronger, because they've had a lot of support from the West, from the United States especially, and from Iran, in building up their brute force to fight against the Islamic State. Well, now they're using that brute force to fight against the Kurds and to limit their aspirations. And so we have a kind of, as I said, a backlash. But the Kurds themselves, I think, are overall, not, again, of course, not every single one of them, but overall, wherever they are, in Europe or in the Middle East or further afield in Nashville, Tennessee, places like that where there are large Kurdish communities, relatively large, 20,000 or so in the United States, in just that one southern city. Everywhere, they tend to be a force for a moderate version of Islam, for integration into their societies while still retaining their own distinctive cultural traditions, and for interfaith dialogue. And I think that's really very admirable. And so I have a lot of, on a personal and as well as an analytical or professional level, a lot of respect for how they've managed against great odds to keep their own identity, but also reach out to others and accept pluralism as the ultimate desirable goal.
Fine. So they were very important in liberating Raqqa.
Yep.
And ISIS is losing territory, as we know, in Syria and in Iraq. What does it mean when it comes to Sweden that they are losing territory? Does it mean there's going to be more activities in North Africa and more activities in Europe? Are we going to see some sort of effects from that here?
Yeah, I think we will. I mean, we already are seeing effects of that. In all the major terror attacks in Europe for the past year and a half, there's been involvement by people coming from the Islamic State. Even though I think a majority have been people born in Europe, but there's been this external.
So the battleground is changing somewhat.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's not gonna. No, the battleground will extend, not change. You're not gonna have peace in the Middle East because Islamic State is militarily defeated. Because as I also point out in the book, and that's still valid, there is no plan for the day after. There is still no plan for the day after. The easy part. And I really do mean that. The easy part is beating them militarily. They never had a chance. As soon as the forces would be arranged to deal with that. that would happen. But then again, there is no plan for what's going to happen afterwards. So know that there will be simmering conflict in the Middle East after the defeat of Islamic State. But it is changing in the sense that, you know, I think in a way you're going to have a similar development as you had after the Afghan-Soviet war, when the so-called Afghanis returned to North Africa and Europe, mostly North Africa, and created a lot of terrorist movements, guerrilla movements, and a lot of conflict. I think the same thing is going to happen here. And North Africa is not a stable area on the planet. So there's and again, it's already happening in Mali, in Niger, in Chad.
Okay.
In
So is there anything we can do? There was a piece in Dagens Nyheter the other week which had the headline, "Nobody can claim that repression works." And in the article there were a few questions, and one of them had to do with maybe repression actually creates more radicalization. And you know, the article was in some ways associating with what's going on in France, where the police and the military has been given, you know, more room to fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any examples that repression actually works?
Well, yeah, there is actually.
Good.
I'm sorry to say, it works fine in many places. You know.
So is that,
I'm not saying to the record, I'm not saying I'm for repression, but it does work sometimes.
Like,
but
can we have an example?
Actually, if you take the French example, you know, I have to. It depends on what you mean with repression, though. The French police and interior forces have been given tools that are now permanent. Yeah. That was only temporary for the past 2 years. I'm not so sure I would call that repression at all. Actually, I think I would call them a more efficient way of combating terrorism, if you ask me. There's still all the trappings of a democratic overview process in France, and so I'm not really worried about France in this case, to be honest. But I don't think. I think it's a false. It is a straw man. It's a false economy to say, oh, either you have repression and you create more terrorists, or you don't. That's not how it is in the real world. Mm-hmm. In the real world, stuff happens, and you have to deal with it. Like, oh, there is an influx there's an increase in terrorist activity. Well, you deal with it. Mm-hmm. It's not repression. You deal with it. Mm-hmm. It can be a repression, of course. Look at the Central Asian states.
So how should we deal with it in addition to repression?
Why do you say repression all the time? Change the wording here.
Okay.
Ricki.
So
it's too polarizing.
What would be a better word?
You're forcing him into a corner. I'll be dangerous.
What would be a better word?
Efficiency. I mean, you can if you're a Western European democracy, you try to be more efficient, fighting an increased threat. You know, if you want to call it repression, well, fine, you do that. I would still argue that so far at least, you know, I think our societies, and I mean in the Western European liberal democratic sense, should be at least equipped to deal with that in a more efficient way, even if it means more repression in a way you say.
So in what way could we in Sweden become more efficient right now?
Well, first thing on my list would be to stop financing organizations back home that are actually you know, helping radicalization, like Islamist organization. Mm-hmm. That would be a very simple, very easy way to do it.
And I think you've said that most of the big organizations, Muslim organizations in Sweden, are Islamist.
Yes, because they are the ones who want to organize. The other ones don't have to. As I said, you know, we are forgetting that this is, and that goes back to what Göran said. We have a liberal democracy here. It's built on being individuals, you know. And again, this is, I'm blushing when I'm saying this because it's so self-evident, or it should be. So you look at the individuals here, and why they can organize all over the place, but they don't have to organize according to their identity politic or multicultural politics as in a collective. The only ones who does that are the Islamists in this particular topic here, because they want to do that, because they want to create these collectives. It's good for them, because that way they can keep the, the control and all that. It's nothing new. It's been going on in Europe for the past, what, 40 years at least, right? Something like that, since the 1960s or 70s in Britain and France. So it's nothing new. It's been going on for a very long time. It's just, again, that slowly that insight is coming to Sweden too.
More examples of repression that works.
Well, look, as Magnus said, don't take this to mean that I'm in favor of repression. But I think just analytically, right, objectively, you could make a very good case that, for example, Russia has managed pretty successfully to repress violent Islamic extremism in its own territory, particularly in the North Caucasus, in Chechnya and Dagestan. The price has been terrible in terms of dictatorship and corruption and loss of life and aggrandizement for a really pretty nasty regime, both in Moscow and in Grozny and in
Uzbekistan.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's different.
Yeah.
I mean, but yes, it's a different government. But the same thing is true in Central Asian countries. But it works in the sense of reducing, greatly reducing, the terrorism and organized Islamic radicalism. And I think that's true in many Middle Eastern countries as well, in Egypt, for example, or what's happening now in Saudi Arabia. It's a complicated trade-off between repression by a monarchy, right? An autocratic government par excellence, but repression directed not only against liberals, but against, really nasty jihadi terrorists too. And it works in the sense of, so far, maintaining pretty reasonable level of stability and functionality and internal peace. It's not the best alternative. A better one, of course, in my view, ideally, right, in some better world, would be, more democratic, more...
Tunisia?
Well, yes, okay, Tunisia, right, okay, fine. But the circumstances of Tunisia, which is the only success story, and even at that, a very fragile one, of the whole Arab Spring, which is where we started this conversation. Tunisia is, I think, and most Tunisians, I think, would agree, and most other Arabs would agree as well, is unfortunately impossible to replicate in other countries. There's something that's different about that society. Mainly the fact that of all these Arab societies, it's probably the most secular. And so that creates a kind of balance between Islamist and more liberal social forces and political parties that keeps the peace. And
they have a civil society, independent of either the state or religious institutions. That's the key. But let me give you an example of why it works in Saudi Arabia. If you're a jihadist and you're in prison there, and they do actually get in prison unless they get shot. But let's say they are in prison. They are giving a choice. If you stop doing this, we're going to give you flat screen TV, you're going to get a car, you're going to get a job, you're going to get, 2 wives, 3 wives, if you stop doing that. And here's the choice. You have to decide right now, yes or no. If yes, you get all this. If no, we're going to take you out and shoot you. You have 15 seconds. And guess what? Most people say, yes, thank you. And if you go back on this, we're going to come after you and shoot you anyway, and your family and everybody you know. Okay. So how do we do it here? In the unlikely event that anyone would actually be put into prison here who's been fighting with the IS in Sweden, I'm still waiting for that to happen. We're not going to do this. And again, for the record, I'm not necessarily in favor of doing this, but it does work. I don't think it's going to work if they get the same deal here, which they're not going to. It will look different. It will look different. But if they say no, nothing's going to happen. You know, nothing's going to happen. They can say, no, I still think this is a good idea. I still think that the ideology here is the good one. So, okay. So nothing happens. And of course, the risk of them going back to doing what they were doing before is much greater here than in Saudi Arabia in this case. So.
Okay, I need a little break here. I want to tell a story. It's too depressing.
Okay, all right.
No, I recently interviewed Bernard-Henri Lévy, the author and the philosopher about the Middle East. And he said that he hopes for a Muslim Sanhedria, a Muslim court. And he was very much inspired by what Napoleon did in 1806. He called for 25 of the most influential rabbis. And he invited them to Paris. And he closed them in a castle. And he said, you have 3 days. And after these 3 days, you have to come up with a decision. You have to come up with an answer. Do you accept the separation between state and religion? And they talked, you can imagine it. And in the end, they said yes. So my question is this anything we can hope for? Is this anything that might in the future happen? Or it's a totally different landscape?
Totally different.
Yeah, totally different.
Okay. So, I like this short answer.
I'm sorry, we shot it down. Sorry about that.
So, no, wait. So, you're quoting this in your book. Al-Sisi, the leader of Egypt, he gave a speech 2015 to an elite religious audience.
University,
right.
Yeah.
And he said that ISIS is in some ways our fault, and we need a religious revolution.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay, what can we say about that? Is that a good beginning, or this is just talk?
Go ahead, Magnus.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, no, I don't think it's just talk. I mean, he meant what he said. Absolutely, he absolutely meant what he said, and I still think you can actually find that speech on YouTube. Yeah, I think it's still there, and it's worth watching actually. No, he's very serious, and he's
but is he doing anything?
Well, yeah, he is. He's again a bit repressive maybe, but yeah, he's trying to change the conversation. I'm not sure it's going to succeed though. But for a number of reasons, that's going to take a long time to go through. But in order for this to happen in Egypt, you need a you need to open up the discussion in a way that at least hasn't happened yet. And of course, but I think there is a chance, it's like he's doing an Ataturk in a sense. So he's trying to just force his people into, hey, this was wrong. We have to redo this and try to do it in a better way than we used to do. But it will take a revolution. And he did use that word. He didn't say reform. He said revolution. And I think he's completely right. And the idea, what he meant was actually exactly that. It's not enough to reform this. We need a revolution. We need a completely new set of tools here to deal with these issues. So, and yeah, he is serious.
But can that be done?
I don't know, is the honest answer. I don't know. You mean in Egypt or in general?
In general.
Oh, in general. I definitely don't know. I absolutely definitely don't know.
Okay, your move.
All right.
Over to Dave.
Okay. I would say that it's not working in Egypt. I think Sisi's speech was very brave, actually, and you know, I agree with it, but Al-Azhar, the Islamic seminary in Cairo that is one of the most influential, or powerful at least, in the Sunni Muslim and especially the Arab world, doesn't agree. And and Sisi, however repressive he may be, has not been able in the last 4 years now that he's been in power to actually make Al-Azhar reform Islam, let alone revolutionize it. So that's not working. But, and I don't see a great hope that something like that is going to work in Egypt, which is a very poor and traditional society in so many ways. But I do think that it's possible in many other Muslim societies, and maybe even in Egypt, and certainly in Europe, to not totally separate Islam from politics. I think Magnus is right, and his book is very instructive that that connection is built in to 14 centuries or 15 centuries of Islamic history and tradition and actual practice. Not totally separate it, but at least limit the impact of hardline religious Islamic views on politics and public life in Muslim countries and in Muslim communities in the West. Limit it, right? And it's also possible, I think, to reform Islam itself, not in some, you know, formal way, like with the Sanhedrin. No, but by gradual efforts at the grassroots level and at the government level in different places, you know, at different times in different ways, bit by bit, to make Islam more enlightened. And there's precedent for this. You know, 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, Islamic scholars were actually, as a group, more moderate, more liberal, more tolerant than many of them are today. And believe it or not, what in Saudi Arabia, and I'll stop with this, we see going on right now, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and in a way this is a sort of an update to just from the last few weeks to your great book. Mohammed bin Salman said in a very important speech, and it's more important than Sisi's speech because he's an absolute monarch and he can make this happen. He said, we want to go back to a more moderate, pluralistic, open-minded, religiously tolerant, even open to other religions, kind of Islam right here in Saudi Arabia. We want to go back to the way things were, and this is the punchline, before 1979.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's not that long ago that even in Saudi Arabia, okay, women, couldn't drive and nobody could vote, not men or women, right? But it was a little bit more, or I would say less extreme, less hardline, less intolerant than it's been in the last 30 or 40 years. And so you can hope for, and I think we are starting to see, real signs of small but positive changes.
So do you feel that we have a role in this?
No.
No? There's nothing we can do?
Look, I think that there's very little that outsiders can do I mean, in your own country, yeah, you have a role.
Yeah,
In Sweden, in the United States, in Europe, as Magnus said, as you said, they're important.
We're doing something right now.
Yeah, okay, so yeah. But for us, on the outside, to affect Islamic reform in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Indonesia or, forget it. Not going to happen.
Okay. So I have one last question, and then we're going to let the audience come in. I read there was an Israeli radio station that reported that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has been in Israel on a secret mission one way or the other, which makes me ask the following question. Can Israel manage to continue to stay outside this conflict? It has succeeded so far, but, is it going to continue like that?
Whom you're asking? It's me again.
I'm going to shoot that over to you.
You were there recently, right?
Yeah, I was. I think Israel will be challenged to stay out of it because of the consequences more immediate. There was an agreement just last week between Russia, the U.S., and Jordan, a ceasefire agreement concerning the southwest of Syria. That is, the border towards the Golan Heights in Israel, and that will put not necessarily Iranian forces, but Hezbollah and Iranian-supported militias very close to the Israeli border. Something Israel has said that's not going to happen, and if it's going to happen, someone's going to get hurt. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult for Israel to deal with that because they don't call the shots on that any longer. Well, if they never did. But if the U.S. is pulling out, which in a sense it is doing, the vacuum will be filled with. It's already filling up with Russian and Iranian forces. So I fear that at the end of the day, Israel will face a choice here. Either they do something about what they say they're going to do, because the forces will be too close for comfort for the Israelis. They're going to be within that line of, I think it was 30 kilometers, wasn't it, Dave? That they said.
It's even less than that.
Yeah. But that's what Israel said.
Oh yeah.
No
that's closer
than no closer than 30 kilometers.
Right.
Now it's going to be down to what, 5?
Yeah, 5. Yeah.
So either they accept that and try to live with the consequences, or they have to act to stop that, which means hitting someone. So I think it's going to be much harder for Israel to stay out of it than it used to be.
David?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's right, but I also think that Israel will try as hard as it can to stay out of it, as much as it can.
Absolutely.
They don't want to get dragged into any of this, and unless they feel that it's in a sort of clear and present danger, right, an immediate military necessity. But I will say at the same time that there are new signs of new thinking in further away from that immediate conflict area, right on Israel's borders, among Arabs especially, rethinking this whole idea that there has to be a perpetual existential conflict between Muslims and Jews, or between Israel and the Arabs, or the Muslim world, many, many more times than I used to see. And I follow the Arab media very closely and Arab public opinion very closely. You find people speaking up and saying that this is bad. We need to find a way to reconcile somehow. So that, and it's not necessarily because of some spiritual awakening. Again, it's because of Iran, and because of ISIS, right? The Islamic State. There are common enemies that they see. Moderate Muslims or Arabs or Sunni Muslims and Israel now have common enemies, and so maybe they need to find some way to work together, or at least not fight each other. And I think what you see today, and I know this actually from the surveys that I do, is that the Arabs in general are more inclined, at the popular level, are more inclined to support peace with Israel than the Palestinians themselves right now.
Okay, thank you very much, and we are ready for questions. Do we have a mic that we can... Right. Okay. Any questions? There must be questions.
There must be. There must be questions.
Have we covered everything?
We answered all the
Yeah, all the questions.
Everything we cover.
That's how good we are.
I think it was Göran, you said that they said we couldn't do anything to help inside in the countries, and perhaps it was you, David. Are there things that we shouldn't do to not exacerbate it, or to let them take care of it with us, without us getting in the way?
Yeah.
Did everyone hear the question? Yes. Yeah, okay.
I think that was to you, right?
I guess so, yeah, because I'm the guilty one here who said there wasn't anything we could do. But I think you're exactly right. There are things that we should avoid doing, and because that would make things worse, I think. And I think a perfect example is the idea that some people have that we should push with using, I don't know, economic leverage or public diplomacy, you know, sort of public statements or something, that we should push governments in Arab countries or elsewhere in the Muslim world to open up to the Muslim Brotherhood or to other currently underground Islamist movements or organizations. I think that's a mistake, because if we do that, the people who support that, I think sincerely believe that they're advocating for democracy, right, and openness. But the practical effect, I'm afraid, would be to open up to precisely the kinds of radical, or at least hardline Islamic movements that would make things even worse in the long run. So that's something we should avoid doing. Thank you for the question.
Hello, my name is Omar Makram. It's interesting that you brought up Egypt. I'm from Egypt, and I'm an ex-Muslim, and I have asylum here in Sweden because of my views on Islam. I have a comment and a question. First of all, my comment is I have to signal a differing of opinion when it comes to the prospect of reformation of Islam, which I don't really believe in. I believe more in reformation of Muslim society, so to speak. But in my opinion, that has to do more with moving away from religion towards secularism, and not trying to adhere more to a form of so-called reformed religion. And I would like to hear your opinion on that. That's one thing. And to Magnus, I want to hear your thoughts on whether we could be focusing or doing too much on policing jihadists or going after violent extremists, rather than to tackle the ideology behind it. Is that something that could be lacking? Is there too much focus on just trying to catch the bad guys rather than to tackle the ideology behind violent extremism? Thank you.
Sure, you mean here in Sweden, right?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with that. In a sense, it's a lot easier, both from a societal and judicial point of view, to go for obvious reasons. You should go, for the bad guys. You should try to catch the bad guys, preferably before they do anything. And yes, there is absolutely a lack of engagement towards the milieus that very often creates these jihadists. So for sure, you're right about that. I think it's as I point out in the book too, and as we've been saying here in the discussion, you know, that needs to be tackled, because it's the ideology behind this that really is driving force here. So sure, you're absolutely right there. On the topic of Islamic reformations, the people I'm quoting in the book, or some of them are saying both that some are arguing like you are, you know, it needs to be completely separated. That's what everybody seems to agree with. At the end, you know, the end result must be a complete separation here, like the Sanhedrin, you know, take that example. But I do agree with Dave that that's going to be very, very difficult, because it's wired into the system, you know, for 1,500 years. It's going to be very hard to accomplish that. And maybe a way to accomplish it would be, you know, a gradual reformation. Again, I think Sisi was right. It still is right. Reforms is not enough. You need revolution. But to get there, I think, you know, reformation might be a step in the right direction. But there needs to be a clear break at the end of the day, at the end of the process.
I think to a great extent I believe I agree with you, because I mean, in Sweden there is a lot of rhetoric. People speak about atheist fanatics and atheist fundamentalism as if this is the same thing as a belief. But then I think that people seem to forget that what atheists and secular-minded people are advocating is just the separation of church and state. And I think that's simply a good thing. And it creates more tolerant and open societies. So I'm in favor of that. But on the other hand, I saw a very nice quote by the old British author, J.K. Chesterton. He said that we have stopped believing in God, but we haven't stopped believing. I think that sums up a lot of things, because, and then people also talk about some kind of liberal water soup. It's too thin. There's nothing in it, you know. You can just, it's like drinking silver tea. There's nothing in it. And most people, they can't live on that. I mean, we are the select few, but we also need, I mean, this is also a kind of elitist discourse. You could say that, even though I share it, and I think it's a very good path to a better society. But I would say still, basically, most people on the planet, they cling to religion of all forms as some kind of safety net, and because it makes them secure. And you can say anything you want about it. You can say it's like a stitch. You can say the only thing you need is 2 strong legs, and then you can walk. You can say all these things, but still, I still would say that to most people that's simply not the case. They need something to cling to. And so even though I'm an atheist, and I think I would believe in what you're saying, and we would agree, it is a problem, because maybe it's a question of education, and so that's something I'm not sure. It's kind of an idealistic position, and then we have the realism, and which is much more muddled, of course.
More questions?
Yeah, well, one over here.
Yeah, but this one.
Okay, with the ISIS, okay. Hi, over here. So with ISIS imploding or losing the battle down in the Middle East, at least according to several news sources, how do you foresee the future, the next couple of years, both in Middle East and as far as specifically Sweden and Scandinavia, Northern Europe?
Where is the question?
There, okay.
Yeah. Well, as I said, you know, the military part of it is well, it's not done yet, but it's more or less over, I would say. I mean, you know, there's going to be a few scattered villages left, and that, in a sense, will be the easy part, even if it's taken way too long. But since there is no idea of solving the, you know, you can't it's like putting Humpty Dumpty together again, if you know what I mean. That doesn't ring any bells for any Swedes. But you can't, for the Americans it's that. You can't put Syria together again. It's not going to happen. You know, forget it. You can use repression again. That will be the only way, I think. I have a hard time seeing that happening, at least with Assad still in power. You know, if he has to go in order to get Syria back together again. And even that's going to be a very, very tall order. And as long as there's no clear thinking of how that process should be done, and there isn't, you know, right now we in the West and in the US has left this discussion for the Russians and the Iranians and the Turks. That's bad news all over. It's not going to lead to a peaceful solution of the conflict in Syria. And that's the case right now. That is what's going to happen, I think, unless something, unless the Europeans, the fickle Europeans or the US steps up to the table and says, and you know, sort of retake a position here. And I don't really see that happening. So the realist in me has to see that what you probably will have is some kind of forced peace, you know, forced agreement in Syria. With Assad there, there's going to be some kind of agreement and say, like I think President Trump was saying that you know, this will be for the Syrians to decide. How the heck are they going to decide this? It's not going to be any free elections here. That's just rhetoric. So that in itself is not going to change anything. But that is what's going to happen, I think. You know, there's going to be some kind of agreement, and the Iranians and the Russians will call the shots. But long term, it's not going to create peace there, and it's not going to create peace in Iraq either. So you know, even if on the face of it you might, if not completely stop, at least you're going to get rid of most of the shooting. I think that's going to happen too. But no peace, no long-term peace. I'm sorry to say. I'm very pessimistic there. And I think in a sense, again, nothing is ever inevitable and nothing is maybe too late. But it's very late if we want to stop this process. It's very, very late. And I can't see any European politician anywhere, really, who would, you know, face this challenge right now. That was gloomy.
Well, that was kind of gloomy. I agree with most of it. I would just add one thing as I see it, and that is a lot of people are talking about whether after the military defeat, whether of ISIS, right, the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq, whether that will mean, number one, and this came up before, whether that will mean that there'll be more terrorists coming back to their home countries, including Europe, or just fleeing and ending up in Europe or maybe in the United States or in some other countries and continuing to be terrorists, just not in Iraq or Syria. That's number one. Number two, whether, because there won't be a lasting, real peace agreement among the people of Syria or of Iraq, whether there'll be an ISIS, an Islamic State 2.0, you know, right, a new version of it, just the way Al-Qaeda has kind of regenerated itself after being forced underground in Afghanistan. And I'm going to take a risk here and say that I'm relatively optimistic on both counts. I
really?
I don't think that the military defeat of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is, in and of itself, is going to create a big new wave of terrorism outside of Syria and Iraq. I think, yes, there will be some foreign fighters, jihadis, you know, who will run away and end up here or in New York or in, you know, Cairo or Casablanca or something. But I think most of them are getting killed or caught And I think that we're all very alert to this danger, and so we're going to probably be able to stop, not every single one, but most of these people. And I think the military defeat of the Islamic State will have a real deterrent effect on their ability to recruit new fighters and to be a source of inspiration for lone wolves or, you know, would-be jihadis, because this is not a winning cause anymore, and people know it. And so I'm, I guess, less, I'm not going to say more optimistic, but less pessimistic than some other also very good observers and analysts of this problem. I think that what we did to the Islamic State is not going to solve all the problems of Syria and Iraq, or of jihadism, or of Muslim minorities in the West, or any of those things, but it is going to reduce this particular terrorist problem to much more manageable proportions. And I think that's more or less what happened with Al-Qaeda after September 11, 2001. It didn't go away, but it was greatly, greatly weakened by military action and continuing security measures, and that has to continue, but it will be, I think, I hope, relatively effective.
Okay, more questions?
Pardon? Yes. Hello. My name is Helene Bergman. I'm a journalist, and I have been writing a lot about Islamism and feminism. And yes, and I saw, Mr. Pollock, that you had also made surveys about the equality in the Middle East. Can you tell us, or me, what is the result of that, and how is the women's situation in these countries? Are they uprising, or are they going down?
Wow, that's a great question. Big, very big subject. Impossible for me to give a simple answer. I think the women's rights are a central issue in the whole debate about Islam and Islamic politics and Muslims in the West and in these societies themselves. But each society in the Muslim world has a kind of a different experience and a different approach. It's not, you know, a single story, far from it. And so I think, let's take just a couple of examples. In Tunisia, I think that one of the main reasons why it is still a relative success story, and where Islam is part of politics but doesn't take over politics after it became more democratic, is the women's movement in Tunisia. It's very clear to me and to my Tunisian colleagues that women as individual political activists, as organization, have played a crucial role in keeping Tunisia away from turning from a military or a security dictatorship into an Islamic dictatorship. Women have really been like on the forefront of that, which is very, very important and admirable in my view. In most other countries, I think women are very active in trying to push for reforms, but they're less able to do it. They face you know, more pressure, more obstacles, less support even from other women. And but I will say, again, I come back to the example of Saudi Arabia right now, because it's you know, it seems maybe to most of you ridiculous to say that giving women the right to drive is a step forward, but it is compared to, you know, where we are right now. And it's a small step, and it's way, way, way overdue, but it's significant. And I think that without protests and pressure over a long period, not one single big demonstration or, you know, sudden or single individual leader, but long, persistent, patient, sometimes quiet pressure from women's activists inside Saudi Arabia, this wouldn't have happened. And so it's or wouldn't be happening. It's still in the works, you know, it's still looking forward a few months. So I think this is really significant but gradual, very, very gradual.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing here. I think you're right, but I think one of the problems here relates, I mean, from a Western point of view, relates to, again, I think one of the flaws of multiculturalism, namely the fact that we see exotic foreign cultures as united, homogeneous, and hence we tend to highly, ferociously underestimate inner tensions with these societies, because they are supposed to be nice and enriching, etc. And then, as a result, you have, for instance, in Sweden, you have a very strong, very, very strong feminist movement. But I think sometimes they focus on problems for Swedish women. And of course, there are problems for Swedish women too. But I think in the broader perspective, these problems are less important than the problems for women in other cultures and other religions. Yeah. Women who live in very highly conservative societies. So I think this is oddly, this leads to a conclusion that for instance, the Swedish feminist movement, and I'm not sure if I'm entitled to say this, but I'm saying it nevertheless, that they are somehow myopic. They are only concerned with, it's a bit kind of a nationalistic idea within Swedish feminism, only focusing on problems in Sweden for Swedish women. And while we actually, men and women in Sweden, we belong to clearly the upper class of the world. So it's like a game within the elite where we are trying to, I mean, of course there are problems here, you can't deny that, but if you take the broader perspective, I think there is something pretentious and a little bit arrogant and self-consumed about the whole discussion in Sweden. And then I think that these problems of multiculturalism, seeing exotic cultures as homogeneous, and you're not allowed to question anything in it, is part of the picture. The exoticism, the idealization of everything overseas, is part of the problem here, I think.
Johan?
Well, thank you, Ricki, Magnus, David, and Göran, for joining us here today, and especially to Magnus. Thank you, Magnus.
Thank you.
David. No flower.
This is nice.
Göran.
Tack så mycket.
And Ricki.
Wow, det var inte dåligt.